I speak 11 tongues. The declaration crashed through the grand hall of St. James's Palace like thunder breaking over stone. Emma Clark's voice, though trembling at the edges, carried a firmness that made the crystal chandeliers seem to hold their breath. The words hung suspended in the perfumed air, defying gravity and reason alike, cutting through the murmur of Europe's most powerful gathering like a blade through silk. Have you ever stood before someone who underestimated you? Someone who looked at your appearance and decided what you were worth before you said a word? Hold that feeling close, because what Emma was about to do would remind them all that dignity cannot be bought, sold, or silenced. Prince Alexander of Wales threw his head back, and laughter erupted from deep within his chest, a cruel, theatrical sound designed to humiliate. His fist struck the ancient oak table with such force that his emerald ring rang out like a struck bell, the metallic sound echoing through the vaulted chamber and bouncing off walls that had witnessed centuries of power. 11 tongues, he roared, his voice dripping with mockery sharp enough to cut. This ragged little beggar expects us to believe such fantasy. The hall erupted like a disturbed beehive. 200 silver candelabras blazed overhead, their flames dancing with cruel delight as European nobility gathered for the Congress of Ambassadors dissolved into waves of laughter that crashed against the marble columns. Gentlemen in tailcoats slapped their knees until their hands went red. Ladies in silk gowns, worth more than most families earned in a lifetime, hid smirks behind ivory fans painted with pastoral scenes that mocked their cruelty. The very walls seemed to mock her, the stone itself joining in the humiliation. Beneath those rivers of light, Alexander stood draped in royal blue velvet, trimmed with ermine, the crown prince's coronet catching every flicker of flame and throwing it back tenfold. His golden beard, perfectly groomed and oiled, trembled with amusement. His blue eyes, the color of winter ice, gleamed with absolute contempt. He was power incarnate, arrogance given flesh and blood, the embodiment of centuries of royal privilege that believed itself untouchable. And before him, barefoot on the cold marble floor that must have felt like ice against her skin, stood Emma Clark, barely 12 years old, so small she seemed almost breakable. Her sack dress was patched and faded, the color of old dishwater held together with stitches she'd made herself by candlelight. Her auburn hair was tangled and wild, uncombed for days, with bits of straw still caught in the strands from the stable where she'd slept the night before. But her grey eyes, oh, her grey eyes contained something that contrasted violently with her fragile appearance. A determination, a fire that refused to be extinguished even under the weight of all this mockery. But what secret burned behind those eyes? What had this child lived through to stand so firm before a prince's mockery? She had arrived at the palace seeking work as a translator, daring to interrupt the most important diplomatic gathering of the year. The guards had almost thrown her out into the rain-soaked streets, but something in her voice, when she shouted her claim, a conviction that couldn't be faked, made them pause, made them bring her before the prince himself, if only for entertainment value. 11 tongues, Alexander repeated, circling the table to address his audience like an actor playing to the gallery. His boots, polished to a mirror shine, clicked against the marble with each deliberate step. Did you hear that, gentlemen? Next she'll tell us she's the daughter of the Tower of Babel itself. Laughter crashed over the hall like ocean waves against cliffs, relentless and merciless. The French ambassador, Marquis de Fontaine, resplendent in crimson and gold, with the Legion of Honor pinned to his breast, mockingly tossed a coin to the marble floor. It clinked and rolled, the sound obscenely loud in the brief silence, stopping near Emma's bare feet. "Someone teach her to count," he bellowed, his accent thick with condescension, his jowls shaking with laughter. Perhaps she confused her fingers with languages. "These street rats will invent anything for a piece of bread," spat Countess Beatriz de Valencia, the Spanish representative, dripping in emeralds that caught the candlelight like trapped stars. She raised a perfumed handkerchief to her nose as if Emma's poverty had a smell that might contaminate her. An Italian lord, Duke Alessandro Visconti, leaned back in his chair, wine sloshing dangerously in his crystal goblet. Perhaps she knows 11 ways to beg. Shall we have her demonstrate those instead? The table erupted again, the cruelty feeding on itself like fire consuming dry wood. The cruelty multiplied, feeding on itself in a frenzy of aristocratic disdain. Perhaps you've also felt the weight of mockery, the sting of words designed to make you feel small, insignificant, invisible. But watch closely what happens when someone refuses to shrink, when someone decides that their truth is more powerful than the world's lies. Emma felt the heat rise in her cheeks, felt the weight of every eye pressing down on her like stones piled on her chest. Her hands trembled at her sides, her fingernails digging crescents into her palms. But she did not look away. She would not give them that satisfaction. Dignity is not negotiated, it is defended. And something in the way she stood, shoulders back despite her fear, chin raised despite her poverty, told everyone watching that this child understood that truth better than they did. Alexander approached her slowly, deliberately, like a wolf circling wounded prey that had nowhere to run. His boots clicked against the marble, each step measured for maximum theatrical effect. When he stood before her, he bent down, bringing his face level with hers, close enough that she could see the pores in his skin, the small scar above his left eyebrow from a fencing match. His breath smelled of brandy and privilege, of meals that cost more than she'd eaten in a month. "Very well, little liar," he said softly, though his voice carried to every corner of the hall with practiced ease. "I'll give you one chance to prove your supposed gift." He straightened, addressing the assembly with a showman's flair. "If you can converse fluently with each of the 11 ambassadors present here in their native tongue, without a single error, responding to whatever they ask with perfect grammar, perfect accent, perfect understanding." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the impossibility of the task sink into every mind. "I'll appoint you royal translator of the crown, with all the honors, titles, and fortune that position commands." A murmur of interest rippled through the crowd. Some leaned forward in their seats, intrigued despite themselves. The trap was set, baited, ready to spring. But who was truly caught in this web? "But when you fail," Alexander continued, his smile sharpening into something cruel and cold, "when you stumble over the first language, when your fraud is exposed before these witnesses from 11 nations, you'll be publicly branded a liar and expelled from London forever. Your name will be recorded in the official books as a cautionary tale against hubris, a warning to other street urchins who dare to reach above their station." The hall plunged into expectant silence, so complete you could hear the candles burning. The ambassadors settled in their seats, arms crossed, faces arranged in expressions of skeptical amusement, ready to witness a delicious humiliation they would recount at dinner parties for months. The air grew thick, electric with anticipation. What no one knew, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that this moment had been 12 years in the making, forged in darkness and pain and love, stronger than iron. If this story has already moved you in these first moments, tell us in the comments from which city you're watching and leave your like to keep accompanying us. Who has felt underestimated? Write "me" in the comments. Emma closed her eyes, and the grandeur of the hall faded like mist burning off in morning sun. The laughter disappeared. The chandeliers dimmed. She was somewhere else entirely, pulled back through time by memory's irresistible current. A small stone cell in Edinburgh's darkest prison, bars of iron rusted and cold, the smell of damp and decay that never left your clothes, your hair, your skin. Her father's face, gaunt but gentle, illuminated by a single candle that cost precious pennies they didn't have. Professor William Clark, the greatest linguist of Edinburgh, a man who spoke 17 languages fluently and could read ancient texts that made other scholars weep with envy, imprisoned on false charges of treason because he had translated documents that revealed inconvenient truths about the Crown's dealings. "My daughter," his voice whispered through memory, weak from hunger but still carrying that teacher's warmth that no prison could extinguish. "Each language is a bridge to a people's soul. Learn all you can, because knowledge is the only freedom no one can steal from you. They can take my life, my reputation, my body, but they cannot reach inside here," he tapped his temple, "and steal what I know. And I'm giving it all to you." Night after night, between those bars that separated them, he had taught her with a dedication that bordered on desperation. French, while the guards changed shift at midnight. Italian during the dinner hour, when the sounds of eating covered their voices. German in the dead of night, when only rats witnessed their whispered lessons. He poured every language he knew into her young mind, like water into a vessel, knowing his time was running out, feeling death's cold approach with each weakening breath. But why had this brilliant scholar been imprisoned? What had he done to anger the Crown so completely that they would let him die in darkness? Can you imagine teaching your child in a prison cell, knowing you'll never see them grow up, knowing that every lesson might be your last? That kind of love doesn't just teach, it transforms. It creates something unbreakable. When he died in those dungeons on a February night so cold, the water in the cell had frozen, he left her with nothing material, no inheritance, no property, no titles. But he left her with the contents of his mind, downloaded into hers like a sacred trust, and the burning need to prove that his life, his suffering, his death had meant something. That truth could not be buried with his body. Emma opened her eyes. The hall snapped back into focus with almost physical force, the sneering faces, the glittering jewels. The man who had destroyed her father, standing before her in royal blue, waiting for her failure, anticipating her humiliation like a fine wine. But he didn't know. None of them knew what was coming. "I accept, Your Highness," she said. Her voice was steady now, all trembling gone, clear as a bell ringing across morning fields. "Have you ever been in a moment where everything you've suffered, everything you've lost, every tear you've cried in darkness comes down to a single choice? Perhaps you or someone close has felt that kind of pressure, that instant when you must either break into pieces or become something harder than diamond." The test began, and the world held its breath. The French ambassador rose first, smoothing his crimson jacket with self-important gestures. He addressed Emma in rapid French, his words a carefully constructed trap designed to trip up even educated speakers. He asked about Cartesian philosophy, about the nuances of Descartes' method of doubt, using vocabulary that most nobles in that room didn't understand, technical terms from philosophical texts. His smirk said clearly, "Let's see you fail immediately, little girl." The room held its breath. Would this be her first and final failure? But then Emma spoke, and the world shifted on its axis. Her French flowed like water over smooth stones, her Parisian accent so flawless that the Marquis's eyes widened in shock. She quoted from Descartes' Meditations from memory, not just translating, but understanding, engaging with the concepts at a level that made the ambassador lean forward despite himself. "Je pense, donc je suis," she concluded in perfect French. But Descartes also understood that doubt itself requires a thinking mind. The very act of questioning proves existence. To doubt is to think, and to think is to be. The skeptic defeats himself by the very act of skepticism. Her syntax was perfect, her philosophical understanding profound. The ambassador sat down slowly, heavily, his smirk fading into something like respect. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wine-glass. A murmur rippled through the hall like wind through wheat. Who was this child? Where had she come from? The Italian representative, Duke Visconti, stood next with false confidence, certain she couldn't possibly continue this impossible performance. This had to be luck, a memorized phrase. He switched to Tuscan Italian, asking about Dante's Divine Comedy, expecting her to falter on the archaic vocabulary. But what happened next left him speechless, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. Emma smiled softly, her first smile of the evening, and began to recite from Inferno, Canto 3, her Italian rich with the musicality of Florence. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura, che la diritta via era smarrita. She continued for several verses, her pronunciation perfect, her understanding evident in every inflection, every pause, placed exactly where Dante would have placed it. The Italian sank into his chair, his face pale as milk. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. How could a street child know classical poetry? Impossible. But the impossible was happening before their eyes. Tell us, have you ever witnessed someone exceed every expectation placed on them? When talent meets preparation, when love meets determination, the result is undeniable. And Emma was proving something that terrified the powerful in that room, that greatness has nothing to do with birth. One by one, they came like soldiers to a battle they couldn't win. The German ambassador, Baron Friedrich von Heidelberg, asked about Goethe's Faust. Emma discussed the tragedy of knowledge and damnation in High German so perfect that the Baron removed his monocle to wipe tears from his eyes. She spoke of Faust's bargain with Mephistopheles as if she'd walked through the pages herself. The Russian envoy, Count Dmitry Volkonsky, tested her with Pushkin, expecting Western ignorance of Eastern literature. She recited Eugene Onegin in flawless Russian, her accent carrying the refined tones of St. Petersburg's aristocracy, her understanding of the tragic romance making the Count nod slowly, respectfully. Who hasn't felt underestimated at some point in life? Who hasn't had someone look at them and decide their worth based on appearance alone? Emma's story is becoming your story, our story, the story of everyone who refused to be small. The Portuguese representative, Senhora Catarina Braganza, tried to trick her with regional dialects from Lisbon to the Brazilian colonies. Emma switched between them effortlessly, explaining the differences as she did so, discussing how Portuguese had evolved differently across the Atlantic, her knowledge so complete it seemed supernatural. The Greek ambassador posed questions about ancient philosophy in modern Greek. Emma responded with ease, then surprised him, stunned him by quoting Plato's Republic in ancient Greek, explaining that her father believed one should understand the roots of language to truly master it. Respect is earned, not given, and with each perfect answer, Emma earned what Alexander could never purchase with all his gold. The hall had transformed utterly. No one laughed now, no one smirked. The silence was total, broken only by Emma's voice, shifting from language to language like a bird changing songs, each one more beautiful than the last. Classical Arabic flowed from her lips as she discussed Islamic poetry with the Ottoman envoy. Her pronunciation of the difficult sounds so accurate, he placed his hand over his heart in a gesture of deep respect. Ecclesiastical Latin resonated through the vaulted ceiling as she conversed with the Vatican delegate about theology, quoting Augustine and Aquinas, her Latin carrying the weight of scholars who had dedicated lifetimes to its study. When the Qing dynasty representative, Minister Chen Wei, stood with arms crossed and skeptical eyes, certain that this Western child could not possibly know the complex tonal language of his homeland, Emma bowed respectfully, correctly, with the proper depth for addressing a dignitary, and began to speak in perfect Mandarin Chinese. Her tones were precise, her vocabulary sophisticated, her grammar flawless. She discussed Confucian philosophy, quoted classical Tang dynasty poetry that most Chinese scholars struggled with, and even made a gentle joke in Cantonese that made Minister Chen laugh, genuinely, delightedly, for the first time that evening. She didn't merely translate mechanical words from one tongue to another. She understood. She embodied each language, inhabiting it as if she'd been born speaking it, as if she carried the soul of each culture inside her small frame. Cultural references, historical nuances, idioms that only natives knew, colloquialisms that couldn't be learned from books alone, she wielded them all with the ease of a master craftsman who had spent decades perfecting their art. But with each language she spoke, a question grew heavier in the air, pressing down on everyone present. Where had this street child learned all this? How was any of this possible? The 11th ambassador, Count Jan Kowalski from Poland, stood with arms crossed and jaw set, certain she would finally fail because Polish was notoriously difficult for foreigners. Emma addressed him in Polish, so perfect it made his breath catch. She discussed the partition of his country by foreign powers with such sensitivity and historical knowledge, with such understanding of the pain her words carried, that tears filled the man's eyes and spilled down his cheeks without shame. When she finished, when that 11th language hung in the air like the final note of a symphony, the crushing silence that fell upon the court was unlike anything the palace had ever known. It was the silence of shame, of awe, of witnessing something that should not be possible but undeniably was, of a world turned upside down and inside out. Alexander's face had transformed throughout the ordeal like a sculpture being chiseled into something new. The smirk had died after the 3rd language. By the 5th, disbelief had crept in like frost across glass. By the 8th, terror, real, genuine terror, had replaced the arrogance. Now he stood frozen, his skin pale beneath his golden beard, his blue eyes wide, with something that looked like horror, like a man watching his entire worldview collapse into rubble. Who taught you?" The question escaped his lips in a whisper, but in that vast silence, everyone heard it. Everyone leaned forward to hear the answer. The moment of truth had arrived, like an executioner's blade, but even now no one in that glittering hall understood just how devastating the revelation would be, the price that truth would demand. What you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about this story. If you're with us until here, leave your comment with a heart emoji and subscribe so you don't miss our next stories that touch the soul. Tell us, do you believe knowledge is the most powerful inheritance? Emma raised her chin, and something in her posture changed. She was no longer the frightened child. She was her father's daughter, carrying his legacy in every word. "My father," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner, "Professor William Clark, whom your Highness imprisoned 5 years ago. You falsely accused him of treason for translating forbidden texts that challenged the Crown's narrative about the Highland clearances. He died in your dungeons after 3 years of imprisonment without trial." The words fell like stones into still water, ripples spreading outward in expanding circles. The ambassadors exchanged glances, sudden understanding dawning on their faces like sunrise breaking over a dark landscape. So that was the connection. So that was why. "But every night," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger, rising like a tide that could not be held back, "between the bars of his cell, with guards walking past and rats scurrying in corners, he taught me, one language at a time, French on Mondays, Italian on Tuesdays, each night a different tongue until I knew them all. He said, if someday you can stand before the prince and prove that knowledge has no social class, that wisdom lives in the hearts of the condemned as surely as in the halls of power, then my life will have meant something. Then my death will not be in vain." Have you ever loved someone so much that you wanted to prove the world wrong about them? That their life mattered, Their love counted. Their sacrifice meant something. That's what Emma was doing, not seeking revenge, but seeking justice for a father's memory. The truth crashed over the assembly like a tidal wave. The man Alexander had destroyed, the scholar he had condemned as a traitor and left to rot in darkness and cold, had raised a prodigy who now stood before 11 nations, exposing the crown's injustice with nothing but her brilliant mind and her father's love. Knowledge cannot be imprisoned, dignity cannot be negotiated, love cannot be killed. The French ambassador rose to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against marble. Then the Italian, then the German. One by one, like dominoes falling in sequence, the ambassadors stood, not in applause for the prince, but in reverence to Emma. They bowed to this barefoot child who had demonstrated more grace, more intelligence, more dignity than all the crowned heads of Europe combined. The moral weight was unbearable, crushing. Alexander felt it pressing down on him like a physical force, like the weight of all his sins made manifest. His chest tightened until breathing hurt. His breath came shallow and quick. Have you ever seen the moment when power realizes it has no power? When all the gold and all the titles and all the armies mean nothing against simple, devastating truth? The Polish ambassador spoke, his voice cutting through the hall like a knife. Your Highness, in my country, we have seen tyrants imprison scholars for telling truths that make them uncomfortable. I had hoped England was different. This child has shown us otherwise. This child has revealed what we all suspected but feared to say. And shown us, added Minister Chen Wei, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of Chinese wisdom, that the human spirit cannot be chained. Knowledge, once planted in fertile soil, grows even in darkness, perhaps especially in darkness. Alexander stumbled backward, his hand gripping the edge of the table for support. His entire world was crumbling. Everything he had believed about power, about his divine right to judge and condemn, about the natural order of nobility over poverty, was turning to ash in his mouth. In that moment of his greatest vulnerability, when all his masks had been stripped away, Emma did something that would be remembered for generations, that would be told and retold in 1,000 taverns and drawing rooms across Europe. She walked forward, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. She stood before the prince, close enough to touch him, and instead of triumph in her eyes, there was something else, something that looked almost like pity, like compassion for a man who had lived his entire life in a cage of his own making. Perhaps you've also learned that true victory isn't about revenge, but about proving that love and teaching can survive even the darkest injustice, that dignity matters more than gold. I didn't come for riches, Your Highness, she said softly, but every ear strained to catch her words. I didn't come for titles or gold or positions at your court. Alexander looked up at her, this child he had mocked so cruelly, and waited for the final blow, for the humiliation he knew he deserved. I came so you would know, Emma continued, and now tears did fall. Quiet, dignified tears that traced paths down her dirty cheeks, that the man you destroyed was innocent, that every night you slept in your silk sheets, he was teaching his daughter to be better than her circumstances, better than bitterness, better than hatred, to rise above cruelty with knowledge, to prove that wisdom needs no crown, that love needs no title, that dignity needs no permission. Her voice cracked slightly, the only sign of the ocean of grief she carried inside her small body. Grief for a father who would never see this moment, never know that his sacrifice had borne such magnificent fruit. I ask only one thing. Clear my father's name. Let the record show that Professor William Clark was not a traitor, but a teacher. Not a criminal, but a scholar. Not an enemy of the crown, but a man who believed truth mattered more than comfort. Give him back his dignity, even if you cannot give him back his life. Let history remember him correctly. The hall waited, breathless, every heart hanging on what would come next. Alexander's hands trembled violently. His eyes, which had gleamed with such cruel amusement at the beginning of this night, now shimmered with unshed tears that he could not blink away. The weight of what he had done, not just to Emma's father, but to how many others. How many voices silenced, how many truths buried, pressed down on him until he thought his legs would give way and he would collapse before them all. His voice failed him entirely. He swallowed hard, tasting bile and shame, and tried again. I will do as you ask. Your father's name will be cleared. By royal decree, I swear it. Emma nodded once, a queen acknowledging a subject. Then she did something that shocked everyone in that grand hall, something no one expected. She turned her back on the prince, an act that should have been treasonous, on the position of royal translator, on the fortune in gold that had been promised, enough to live in luxury for 10 lifetimes, on the noble title that could have lifted her from poverty forever, that could have made her acceptable in drawing rooms and ballrooms. She walked toward the palace exit, her patched dress swaying, her bare feet leaving no mark on the pristine marble that had been polished by servants on their knees. Respect is not bought, it is earned. And that night, Emma earned what Alexander could never purchase with all the gold in his treasury. Wait! Alexander's voice cracked across the hall like a whip, desperate, pleading. The position. It's yours. The gold, the title, everything I promised. Please. Emma paused but didn't turn around. The entire court seemed to lean forward. Keep your gold, Your Highness. I have something worth far more. What could possibly be worth more? Alexander asked, genuinely bewildered, genuinely unable to comprehend. Emma looked back over her shoulder, and for the first time that night she smiled. It was her father's smile, gentle, wise, filled with a peace that transcends understanding. The knowledge that I proved him right. That's the only treasure I need. That's the inheritance that matters. She walked out of St. James's Palace, into the London night, into rain that had begun to fall softly, washing the city clean. Behind her, no one laughed, no one mocked. The French ambassador had tears on his cheeks. The Italian crossed himself. The Chinese representative bowed deeply to her departing figure, a bow reserved for emperors. And Alexander, Prince of Wales, heir to the most powerful throne in Europe, sank into his chair with his head in his hands. A broken man who had learned too late that true nobility is not inherited, but earned through dignity and sacrifice. That power without wisdom is tyranny, that a crown without conscience is just expensive metal. That night, London learned something it would never forget. That wisdom needs no crown, that a poor 12-year-old girl, armed only with knowledge and dignity, could defeat the most powerful monarchy in Europe, not with swords or wealth or armies, but with the simple, devastating power of truth spoken in 11 tongues. Weeks later, by royal decree published in every newspaper in the kingdom, Professor William Clarke's name was cleared. A memorial was erected in Edinburgh, honouring him as one of Scotland's greatest minds. And though Emma Clarke never accepted a position at court, never wore fine dresses or lived in grand houses, her name became legend. They called her the Girl of 11 Tongues. But those who truly understood knew she spoke only one language that mattered, the language of dignity, which every human heart can understand regardless of tongue or tribe. Knowledge is the only freedom no one can steal from you. This story reminds us that dignity is not determined by wealth or status or birth. It lives in the choices we make when the world tries to break us, when mockery rains down like stones, when we have every reason to seek revenge but choose grace instead. Perhaps you've also felt underestimated. Perhaps someone has looked at your circumstances and decided what you're worth without knowing your story. Remember, Emma, Remember that knowledge, dignity, and grace are treasures no one can take from you. They are the inheritance that matters most, the wealth that survives every storm. Who among us hasn't been judged unfairly? Who hasn't felt invisible, unheard, dismissed? Emma's story is our story. It's the story of everyone who ever refused to accept the limits others placed on them, who chose to rise when the world said, "Stay down." Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story that touches the heart and changes how we see dignity and knowledge. Tell us in the comments, which part moved you the most? What lesson are you taking with you today? Where are you watching from? Subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our upcoming stories that inspire and transform lives. Leave your like if you believe in the invisible strength of dignity and family. Share this story with someone who needs to remember their own worth today. And if you want to help us continue creating stories like this that defend hope and human dignity, click the thanks or super thanks button below. Every contribution helps us keep bringing these stories to you. Before you go, check out the story we're leaving on the side about another person who defied all expectations. We're sure it will also move you and make you reflect. See you in the next story, and remember, your dignity needs no one's permission. "I speak 11 tongues," declared the girl with firm voice, her words echoing through the grand hall of St. James's Palace. Prince Alexander of Wales erupted in laughter, striking the oak table with his emerald ring until the metallic sound filled the chamber. 11 tongues. "This ragged beggar expects us to believe such fantasy," roared the prince, his golden beard trembling with amusement. The hall blazed under the light of 200 silver candelabras, where European nobility gathered for the Congress of Ambassadors. Alexander, draped in royal blue velvet and adorned with the crown prince's coronet, embodied aristocratic arrogance, his blue eyes gleaming with absolute contempt. Before him, trembling with bare feet on the cold marble, stood Emma Clark, a Scottish girl of barely 12 years, dressed in a patched sack dress and tangled auburn hair, but whose grey eyes contained a determination that contrasted with her fragile appearance. She had arrived at the palace seeking work as a translator, daring to interrupt the most important meeting of the year. 11 tongues! Did you hear that, gentlemen?" shouted the prince to the assembled ambassadors. "Next, she'll tell us she's the daughter of the Tower of Babel." Laughter erupted like waves. The French ambassador mockingly tossed a coin to the floor. "Someone teach her to count," bellowed the Spanish representative. An Italian countess spat. "These street rats invent anything for a piece of bread." Alexander rose from his throne, circling the girl like a wolf stalking prey. "Very well, little liar. I'll give you one chance to prove your supposed gift. If you can converse fluently with each of the 11 ambassadors present here in their native tongue without a single error, I'll appoint you royal translator of the crown. But when you fail at the first language, you'll be publicly branded a fraud and expelled from London forever." The hall plunged into expectant silence. The ambassadors settled in their seats, ready to witness the humiliation. Emma closed her eyes, and her father's face appeared in her memory. Professor William Clark, the greatest linguist of Edinburgh, who died in prison for challenging the crown, but who before taught her every night, "My daughter, each language is a bridge to a people's soul. Learn all you can, because knowledge is the only freedom no one can steal from you." When Emma opened her eyes, there was no more fear. "I accept, Your Highness," she responded. The test began. The French ambassador spoke first, launching a complex question about Cartesian philosophy. Emma responded in perfect French, with flawless Parisian accent, citing Descartes from memory. The Frenchman paled. The Italian representative followed, asking about Dante. Emma recited verses from the Divine Comedy in Tuscan Italian without hesitation. The German ambassador, the Russian, the Portuguese, the Greek, one after another, were disarmed by the girl's absolute mastery. She spoke classical Arabic with the Ottoman envoy, ecclesiastical Latin with the Vatican delegate, Mandarin with poetic fluency before the Qing dynasty representative. Each answer was more brilliant than the last. She didn't merely translate, but understood cultural nuances, historical references, idioms that only natives knew. The hall had shifted from mockery to silent astonishment. Alexander watched, his face transforming from derision to disbelief, and finally to terror. When Emma finished conversing in all 11 languages, a crushing silence fell upon the court. "Who taught you?" whispered the prince, his voice now stripped of arrogance. Emma raised her chin. "My father, Professor William Clark, whom your highness imprisoned 5 years ago, falsely accusing him of treason for translating forbidden texts. He died in those dungeons, but every night between the bars, he taught me a new language. He said, if someday you can stand before the prince and prove that knowledge has no social class, it will have been worth it." The truth fell like lightning upon the hall. The man Alexander had destroyed had raised a prodigy who now exposed the crown's injustice before 11 nations. The ambassadors rose to their feet, not applauding the prince, but bowing to Emma. The moral weight was unbearable. Alexander, defeated, fulfilled his word and offered her the position of royal translator, a fortune in gold, a noble title. Emma shook her head. "I didn't come for riches or titles, your highness. I came so you would know that the man you destroyed was innocent, and that his legacy lives in every word I speak. I ask only one thing. Clear my father's name." She turned and walked barefoot toward the palace exit, leaving behind the gold and glory. This time there was no laughter. Only a shamed prince and 11 nations who witnessed how a poor 12-year-old girl, armed only with knowledge, defeated the most powerful monarchy in Europe. That night, London learned that wisdom needs no crown, and that true nobility is not inherited, but earned through dignity and sacrifice.